welcome back. Or, if this is your first time here, welcome in. You're listening to Sleepless Scholar, where the world gets quieter the longer you stay. If you're someone who prefers history without the drama, facts without the fireworks, and stories that help you drift gently into sleep, you've found the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Find that perfect position where the blankets feel just heavy enough, and let your shoulders sink into the mattress beneath you. If you're using this to fall asleep, you don't need to worry about finishing. That's what the black screen is for. That's what I'm here for. If you truly enjoy these calm, uninterrupted stories, feel free to subscribe. And if you'd like to leave a comment, let me know what time it is where you are right now. It's always fascinating to see who's listening at 11 p.m. and who's still here at 3 in the morning. Tonight's story takes us far back, before coronations, before crowns, before the weight of an empire was ever felt across a shoulder. Tonight, we'll look at what it meant to grow up royal, not in the glittering halls of fairy tales, but in the drafty chambers of palaces carved from stone. What did the future pharaohs dream about? What games did young emperors play when no one was watching? What did a child king fear before he learned to rule? From ancient Mesopotamia to imperial China, from Egyptian courts to medieval castles, this story will drift between the childhoods of rulers whose names you may know, but whose early years you've likely never heard told quite like this. But don't worry if you fall asleep before we get there. The stories will still be here when you wake, before the gold, before the mask, before the tomb sealed tightly. For centuries beneath the sands, there was only a boy born into a world of dust and stone, of incense curling in cool temple air, of sandals slapping against tiled floors, warmed by the midday sun. His name was Tutankhaten, and later Tutankhamun. But before either name meant king, it meant child. He was born into chaos. His father, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, had upended Egypt's ancient traditions, abandoning the old gods in favor of a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk. It was a bold experiment and an isolating one. The capital was moved, the temples shuttered, the priests silenced, and in this new city of Akhetaten, among courtyards and colonnades carved in haste, Tutankhamun took his first steps. He was not expected to rule. His health was fragile, his limbs slightly curved, his gait uneven. Some say he walked with a cane even as a child, but still the halls of his home echoed with lessons. Tutors recited hymns to Aten, while scribes taught him to write his name in perfect hieroglyphs. Servants bathed him in perfumed water. Nurses applied ointments to his joints, combed oil through his hair, measured his brow for ceremonial wigs. He was never alone. Even in his play, he was watched by guards, by elders, by the eyes of gods painted on every wall. But he had toys, carved lions, small wooden boats, miniature bows, and arrows with stone tips. He played as a child plays, with sudden laughter and sometimes sadness. His world was bounded by corridors, but his imagination drifted outward, past the desert, past the river, past the throne. The adults whispered around him of unrest, of hunger, of the old gods stirring in forgotten temples, but he did not yet understand. When Akhenaten died, the court turned inward, and the child, still barely 9, was crowned king. They set the crook and flail in his hands, though they were too large to hold them properly. They lowered the headdress onto his small brow, the gold band heavy enough to slip across his eyes. Priests chanted, trumpets sounded, but beneath the royal kilt he was still a boy with sore knees and dreams he hadn't yet spoken aloud. He was moved from Akhetaten to Thebes, and then to Memphis, and in this return to the old capital, the boy who had been raised under a single god began to learn about many. The priests came back, the temples reopened, the tomb builders began their chisels anew, and Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. His name changed to honor Amun, one of the oldest gods of Egypt. A political move, yes, but also a return to something older, something comforting. He was married young to his half-sister Ankhesenamun. The paintings show them touching hands, a gesture rare and intimate. In one image, she places a lotus crown on his head as he sits, bent forward slightly, the curve of his spine just visible beneath the royal linen. Behind the scenes, the court ruled in his name, viziers, generals, scribes, but he grew, learned, signed documents in his own hand, approved plans, even traveled the land he was meant to rule. But still, he was young and sickly. His bones showed signs of strain, of disease, malaria perhaps, a clubfoot some say. He tired easily, slept long hours, and when he died, around age 19, it was sudden, unprepared. His tomb, famously small and rushed, was never meant for a king, not one with a name that would echo through history. But before all that, before the fame, the artifacts, the curse, he was just a boy who watched the priests light lamps at dusk, a boy who traced the cracks in palace walls when sleep wouldn't come, a boy who held a carved lion in his hands and wondered what it meant to be powerful. His story would be pieced together by strangers thousands of years later, his body unwrapped, his secrets debated, his treasures displayed, but no one could return to those quiet moments, the ones before the crown, before the illness, before the tomb. Only the silence remains, and if you listen closely in that silence, you might still hear him breathing. Before the granite temples and towering obelisks, before she wore the beard of kingship and took the name Ma'at Kare, she was simply Hatshepsut, daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose and Queen Amuse, a girl born not to rule but to observe, a witness in the shadow of power. And yet, even in her quiet beginnings, the rhythm of divinity was already brushing against her small shoulders. Her earliest memories were likely filled with warmth, the scent of myrrh perfuming the linens, the cool splash of servants drawing water into stone basins, the hum of priestly songs floating down polished corridors. She was born in the palace at Thebes, its whitewashed walls rising above the Nile's bend. From the moment she opened her eyes, she was wrapped in ceremony, cradled not just in arms, but in meaning. She was the king's daughter, a title both symbolic and sacred. It afforded her privileges, tutors who read aloud from scrolls of sacred text, artists who sketched the gods with charcoal on papyrus to teach her their faces, servants who brought her dates and honeyed bread when the sun was at its peak. But she also learned expectations, how to sit, how to speak, how to listen without interrupting. She watched her father in court, standing at the edges near columns taller than trees, her small fingers curled into the seams of her embroidered robe. She saw the nobles bow, the scribes murmur, The generals speak with words as sharp as bronze. She said little, but her eyes never wandered. When her younger half-brother, Thutmose II, was born to a lesser wife, the paths of succession grew more tangled. Hatshepsut, of royal mother and royal blood, was of stronger lineage, but Egypt did not expect women to rule. Not yet. So she was married off to her brother as custom dictated, and became great royal wife, a queen beside the king. But in the quiet of her youth, her voice was forming, a soft whisper shaped by observation, honed by restraint. She studied the rituals, she memorized the names of ancestors, she watched how power moved through the room, not always with volume, but with presence, with certainty, with stillness. She bore a daughter, Neferur, and raised her among the priests, but there are hints, scattered in stone and inscription, that Hatshepsut was already preparing for more, that even as a young woman she imagined herself not beside the throne, but upon it. She walked through Karnak temple not just as a worshipper, but as a future builder. She placed her fingers on the sandstone walls, as if she could already feel where her name would be carved. She bathed in the sacred lake with the priestesses, but listened more intently than they knew, gathering the words of rituals, learning the rhythms of ancient hymns, not for prayer, for power. When her husband died, her steps did not falter. The crown passed to her stepson, Thutmose III, still a boy, too young to rule alone, and so the child who once sat quietly at the feet of her father stepped forward, first as regent, then as pharaoh. But long before she stood at the helm of an empire, long before she defied every precedent, there was the girl, the watcher, the listener, the one who smiled politely while learning everything. And now, deep beneath the sands of Deir el-Bahari, her temple still rises with morning light, every wall whispering that memory does not belong only to kings. Sometimes, the child who grows in the silence becomes the ruler who speaks for eternity. Long before he became the first emperor of a unified China, before he commanded armies, built vast networks of roads, or ordered the construction of a wall so long it seemed to touch the sky, he was a child, a boy named Ying Zheng, born into turmoil, raised in suspicion, and destined to rule a land divided by war. He was born in 259 BCE in the state of Zhao, one of 7 warring states locked in constant struggle during the final century of the Zhou dynasty. His father, a prince of Qin, had been held hostage in Zhao as a diplomatic pawn. His mother, a woman of courtly grace but unclear origin, gave birth to him in a place that was not yet home, among people who did not fully welcome his presence. There was no lullaby waiting for him in the cradle, no soft glow of peace outside his window. His first years were marked by murmurs about his legitimacy, about his father's loyalties, about whether the boy would ever live to return to the land of his ancestors. But still, he grew. Within the walls of Zhao, he was watched closely, taught the classical texts, trained in calligraphy and swordplay, fed carefully, guarded always. His nursemaids kept to silence. His tutors wore long robes and spoke in measured tones, correcting the boy's posture with the lightest tap of a wooden fan. He learned early that words had weight, that a single phrase spoken too loudly might echo down the corridors and into ears that should not hear. He became cautious, listening before speaking, calculating before reacting. His gaze was unnerving even then, too steady for a child, too knowing. When he was just a toddler, political winds shifted. His father, through alliance and maneuver, returned to Qin and assumed the throne. The boy followed, now prince of a land he barely knew. But the court in Qin was no sanctuary. It was sharper, colder, filled with factional rivalry and veiled ambitions. Still, he walked its halls with growing certainty. He watched generals draw maps with thick brushes, planning campaigns on yellowed parchment. He listened to ministers argue policy, their voices rising just enough to betray fear. He saw how power shifted, not with a blow of a hammer, but with a stroke of a seal. When he was 9, his father died. Some say it was sudden, others say it had long been planned. Regardless, Yingzheng was crowned king of Qin, a child king. Behind him stood regents and advisors, some loyal, others less so. His mother retained influence. Her advisor, Lu Bue, served as chancellor, but Zheng watched them all. Even as a boy, he seemed to carry the weight of something older, something inevitable. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was direct. There are stories, whispered more than recorded, that say he once dismissed an elder who tried to humor him with riddles. "I do not play," the boy is said to have replied. "I remember." He began to understand what it would take to survive, and not just survive, but rule, firmly, completely, without question. His days were filled with study of military tactics, of law, of the teachings of the legalists who valued order over sentiment. He memorized the punishments for betrayal. He learned how to spot a lie from a glance. He trained with weapons, not to fight necessarily, but to hold them without flinching. And at night, when the fires dimmed and the stone chambers echoed only with wind, he walked the corridors alone, his steps careful, his mind racing. No one knows exactly what the boy thought about as he wandered through those halls. But years later, when he declared himself not just king, but emperor, when he took the title Shi Huangdi, many would say the ambition had been growing since childhood. He unified China before he turned 40, standardized currency, script, measurements, even the width of axles on carts. But all of that, the legacy etched in stone, came later. First, there was the child, the boy who sat so still during court sessions that courtiers wondered if he was listening. The boy who learned to fold silence into power. The boy who became emperor not by luck, but by studying every move made around him and deciding, before he was old enough to shave, that he would outlast them all. And so he did. She would one day charm an empire, ride barges gilded with gold, and speak with Roman generals as equals. But long before she was Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt and last of the Ptolemies, she was simply a girl, watching the tides roll in from the Mediterranean, breathing in the scent of papyrus and perfume, and listening, always listening. She was born into a dynasty of Greeks who ruled Egypt but never quite belonged to it. Her ancestors spoke Greek, wore Macedonian dress, followed Hellenistic customs, and kept their bloodlines tightly wound around themselves. Brothers married sisters, cousins ruled alongside each other, and from this tangled web emerged a girl with sharp eyes, a sharp mind, and a voice that would carry through time. She was raised in Alexandria, a city of splendor and contradiction. The great library stood like a cathedral to knowledge, filled with scrolls from every corner of the known world. The harbor bustled with traders, priests, pirates, and scholars. The streets smelled of fish, salt, ink, and spice. and somewhere in a palace near the shoreline, Cleopatra learned to speak, not just Greek like her family, but also Egyptian and Latin and Aramaic and Hebrew and more. Some say she spoke 9 languages before she was 15. She understood early that power wasn't only in birthright, it was in words, in tone, in knowing how to speak and when to stay silent. Her tutors came from Athens and Rhodes, philosophers, historians, poets, but she also learned from dancers, healers, and temple singers. She absorbed the world like a sponge, retaining not just facts, but rhythm. She could recite Homer and mimic a priestess's chant in the same breath. Her siblings vied for attention. The palace was filled with tension, banquets, alliances, plots barely hidden beneath polite smiles. She watched it all from behind silken veils, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mouth still. But her mind turned like a wheel. She studied the stars, not just for beauty, but for navigation, for omens, for cycles that could be used to predict flood and harvest. She watched the priests weigh hearts in ceremony, and she learned that even judgment had a kind of performance. No one knows when she first realized she would be queen. Perhaps it was when her father, Ptolemy XII, fled the kingdom in disgrace and she stayed behind, calm amid the storms, or when she returned at his side and saw the way Roman power now loomed over the Nile like a shadow stretching from across the sea. She kept scrolls beneath her bed, not love letters or songs, but political maps, trade records, temple accounts. She knew how many grain ships left Alexandria each month and where they went. She knew how Rome depended on them. She understood the balance, fragile, delicate, and made of more than gold. She practiced her public voice in the garden, speaking softly to the reeds, shaping her words so they would fall like honey and strike like thunder. Not loud, just precise. She could command a room without raising her tone, because she'd learned how to make silence her ally. She was not the eldest, she was not the most favored, but she was the one who listened, and the one who remembered, and that, in the end, would make all the difference. The girl who watched the harbor lights flicker on the water, who memorized the lineages of gods and emperors, who traced the outlines of ancient scripts in candlelight. She would grow into a queen who defied nations. But those nights before the crown, the quiet ones, are what shaped her, where the voice of an empire learned to whisper first. He is remembered now for his pillars, tall, smooth columns rising from the earth, inscribed with words of peace, of law, of compassion. Ashoka the Great, emperor of the Maurya dynasty, who spread Buddhism not with armies, but with stone and message. But before the lion capitals and edicts, before he renounced conquest, he was a boy, a prince in a palace of many rooms, where power whispered from every hallway. He was born in the 3rd century BCE, son of Emperor Bindusara. His early years unfolded in Pataliputra, the capital city, a place of stone walls and flowering courtyards, bustling markets, and cold, torch-lit corridors. The Mauryan Empire stretched wide, from the Himalayas to the southern forests, but Ashoka's world began with the tiled floors of his nursery, the voices of guards outside his window, and the scent of wet earth rising from the gardens after the monsoon. He was not his father's first son. There were many princes, many mothers, and each child learned quickly where they stood. There were games, yes, but not the kind played in open fields. These were games of proximity, of attention, of influence. A look from the emperor meant something. So did its absence. Ashoka watched. He was taught Sanskrit and Prakrit, learned to read the Vedas and debate philosophy before he could ride a horse. His tutors did not coddle him. They expected poise, precision. Even as a child, he was taught the laws of Dharma, not merely as moral suggestions, but as codes to live and rule by. He learned martial arts, swordplay, elephant handling. He trained alongside soldiers twice his age, his small hands blistered from bowstrings and spear shafts. He bore it all without complaint. If he was ever hurt, he said nothing, because to show weakness in the court of Bindusara was to be forgotten. And Ashoka would not be forgotten. His skin bore scars early, one from falling against a marble column during weapons practice, another from a hunting accident, but he never flinched from pain. He wore it like armor. The other princes began to whisper about his temper, his ambition, his calm stare. Some feared him, others tried to befriend him. Few succeeded. It's said he once sat in the stables for hours, silent, watching a restless war elephant thrash at its tether. When the beast finally calmed, Ashoka stood and walked away, saying only, "Even fire sleeps." When he was old enough, he was sent away to govern distant provinces, a test, a half-exile. He ruled Ujjain and Taxila, cities known for rebellion and unrest, and yet under his hand they quieted. He applied what he had learned, justice without hesitation, order above comfort. He punished swiftly, rewarded sparingly. He became known as Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce. But deep in his childhood memory there remained a voice, a soft one, a teacher who once spoke to him of balance, of ahimsa, non-violence, of the wheel that turns endlessly, binding all things together. At the time, he had listened without comment. Later, he would return to those words as if they were written on the backs of his eyelids. But for now, he grew hard, sharp, crowned not with kindness, but with iron. When his father died, he fought his brothers for the throne, and won. But the child who once sat silent beneath the banyan trees, watching ants carry away blossoms, had not disappeared. He was there still, behind the emperor's eyes, waiting for the moment when power would meet purpose, and all the lessons he'd carried from that long, narrow corridor of childhood would unfold, not in violence, but in stone. He would grow to be the Sun King, clad in gold, ruling France for more than 70 years. His court would become the center of European splendor, his palace at Versailles a living symbol of power and order. But long before the music, the mirrors, the endless halls, Louis was just a child, a small boy born into suspicion, surrounded by silk and shadows. He entered the world in 1638, a miracle child, born to King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria after more than 20 years of childless marriage. They called him Dieudonné, God-given. From the moment he drew breath, he was a symbol, a hope, and a tool. He did not know the pressures swirling around his cradle. The court was tense, split by rival factions. His father was distant, formal. His mother, warm but wary. And though he would one day hold absolute power, his early world was one of observation, where every movement was watched, every word carried weight. He played in the halls of the Louvre, then still a palace, not yet a museum. The stones echoed with the quiet footfalls of attendants, with the soft voices of tutors reciting scripture, history, and dance. He was trained from his earliest moments to carry himself with poise, to bow with grace, to rise without falter, but he was also lonely. Even surrounded by servants, Louis often found himself in the company of silence. His toys were beautiful, carved and gilded, but the halls were cold, the eyes around him cautious, his playmates chosen with care, his movements scripted. At the age of 4, everything changed. His father died, and Louis, still clutching a wooden horse in one hand, became king. Too young to understand the crown, too small to bear its weight, he watched instead as his mother became regent and Cardinal Mazarin assumed control of the state. Together they ruled in his name, and he was taught to nod, to smile, to sit in the gilded chair and look serene. But he remembered everything. The years that followed were not peaceful. The Fronde, a series of civil wars led by nobles who opposed royal authority, shook Paris and forced the young king into exile more than once. He saw the gates barred, he saw stones thrown, he heard the shouts of angry men outside his window. He remembered the fear in his mother's voice as they fled the city under cover of night. Those memories settled deep. He learned then what disorder looked like, what it felt like to be powerless, and he swore, even as a child, that he would never allow France to fall into such chaos again. He studied harder: history, languages, theology, fencing, music, court etiquette. He practiced his signature until it flowed like water. He was shown the machinery of state, the budgets, the petitions, the whispers behind every appointment. At night he lay in bed beneath a velvet canopy, eyes open to the dark, replaying the day's events like a ledger. He thought of who had bowed too late, who had spoken too freely, who had hesitated, and he smiled less. When Cardinal Mazarin died, Louis was 22. He gathered his ministers and announced calmly that he would now govern alone, without a chief advisor. They were stunned, but Louis had been preparing his entire life. He understood now that ceremony was not decoration, it was discipline. That spectacle was not excess, it was structure. He knew how to use time and appearances and silence. But none of that began at Versailles. It began with the boy in exile, clutching his mother's hand in a carriage lit only by moonlight. The boy who watched France burn around him and decided that if he must rule, he would do so like the sun, steady, distant, unquestioned. She would one day rule one of the largest empires on earth, commanding armies, drafting policies, and earning the title of Great. But before she became Empress of Russia, before the palaces and portraits and proclamations, she was a girl born not in Russia, but in a small drafty manor in Stettin, now Szczecin, Poland, where snow piled quietly at the windows and the rooms smelled faintly of linen, ink, and cold. Her name was Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst. Born in 1729 to a minor German prince and a strict, ambitious mother, she was not raised to be royal. Her world was small, governed by discipline, expectation, and silence. Her father served the Prussian military, stern and distant. Her mother, Johanna, saw court life as a ladder and her daughter as the rung that would rise them all. Sophia's early days were structured with the precision of a clock. Rise with the sun, recite your prayers, Latin before breakfast, dancing by mid-morning, French and history in the afternoon. She wore stiff dresses, ate meals in silence, spoke when spoken to. But even then, there was something sharper beneath her stillness, a curiosity that didn't wane, She read hungrily Voltaire, classical philosophers, histories of distant queens. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words were chosen carefully, like pieces on a chessboard. She walked in the gardens alone sometimes, tracing letters in the frost-covered stone. She imagined palaces, not because she yearned for jewels or ballrooms, but because she believed, even as a child, that she could do better, that she could lead. When she was 14, a proposal came. Russia. The heir to the Russian throne, Grand Duke Peter, needed a bride. Her mother seized the chance. Sophia, still a teenager, was packed and polished and sent across the frozen continent to a court of unfamiliar customs, unforgiving winters, and immeasurable power. She arrived in St. Petersburg in the heart of winter. Her breath curled in the air like smoke as she stepped down from the carriage. The palace loomed ahead, vast and foreign. She spoke no Russian. She didn't yet understand the rituals, but she bowed perfectly, smiled gently, observed everything. She converted to Orthodoxy, changed her name to Catherine, learned the Russian language in whispers and fragments, reciting verses at night when the candles were low. She adjusted, reshaped, became what they needed, but always kept something to herself. Her marriage to Peter was cold. He was moody, erratic, childlike. She was patient, diplomatic, sharp. While he played with toy soldiers, she built alliances. While he insulted courtiers, she earned their favor. She read late into the night, her fingers smudged with ink. She took notes on statecraft, religion, war, and she waited through the years, through her husband's rise to the throne, through his missteps and paranoia, through the slow, uneasy unraveling of his reign. Then, when the moment came, when the people and the guards and even the nobles had begun to murmur her name instead of his, she stepped forward. But she had been preparing since girlhood, since the manor in Stettin, since the cold rooms and quiet lessons, since the day she traced crowns into the frost and whispered to herself, "I could do this." And she did. He is remembered now in stone, towering colossi seated in desert silence, temples aligned with the sun, walls carved with victories, names etched deeper than time. Ramses the Great, pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, builder of cities, father to 100 children. But before the granite there was flesh, before the crown there was a boy. He was born into royalty, but not born to rule. His father, Seti I, was a soldier pharaoh, stern, capable, admired. Ramses was one of many royal children. He was not the eldest, he was not expected to rise. But Seti saw something, and so, while other princes trained in archery and attended court, Ramses was given more tutors, more scribes, more eyes watching him. He was made Prince Regent before he turned 15, but long before that, before he was seated beside his father in gilded chariots, before he held a scepter at ceremonies, he was a child in the halls of Pi-Ramesses, a city still taking shape. He would walk barefoot through the polished corridors, his sandals held by an attendant trailing quietly behind. He would peer through papyrus blinds at the laborers and artisans building what would one day be his legacy. He was fascinated by construction, not merely the grandeur, but the process. He watched masons mix mortar, watched hieroglyphs being etched line by line, watched bronze chisels strike stone like quiet thunder. He asked questions constantly. Why does the sun rise behind that obelisk? How do you balance a statue so tall? Why does the priest walk left, not right? His tutors encouraged it. His father tolerated it. His days were filled with ritual, morning blessings, afternoon study, evening recitation of lineage. He knew the names of his ancestors by heart before he could lift a spear. He memorized the prayers of the gods, the steps of the afterlife, the secret names hidden in the books of the dead. At night he sat in the gardens, listening to the breeze move through the date palms. Sometimes he would press his hand to the stone floor, as if trying to feel the pulse of the earth. He believed the gods walked with him, not in thunder or fire, but in silence, in breath. He trained as a warrior too. He practiced in the barracks, his arms aching from the pull of the bow, the clash of the shield. His chariot was not ceremonial. It was covered in dust, marked by wear. By the time he was a teenager, he could ride into battle formations and shout orders louder than men twice his age. He fought alongside Seti, not just a symbol, but a soldier, and in time he was named successor. When his father died, Ramses became pharaoh, but he had already been one in spirit. He began building not as a statement, but as an instinct. Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, cities, temples and tombs that stretched toward eternity. He saw them not as monuments, but as memory, as permanence, as the answer to every childhood question. He ruled for 67 years, outlived many of his own children, faced enemies and plagues, signed one of the earliest known peace treaties in history, and still he built. But if you looked closely at the statues, the carvings, you'd find again and again the face of a younger Ramses, not the elder statesman, not the bearded god king, but the boy, eyes wide, posture straight, as if still standing at the edge of a construction site, wondering how high the heavens really went. There are no great paintings of them, no statues with serene marble eyes, no golden masks or tombs carved with their names. The boys of Sparta, the lost sons, left behind little but echoes, but once they ran barefoot across the dust of the Eurotas valley. Once they slept beneath cold stars and awoke to orders. Once they were children, not kings, not warriors yet, just boys. In Sparta, a child did not belong to his parents, at least not entirely. At birth, each infant boy was inspected, lifted, turned, examined like a piece of bronze pulled from the forge. Was he strong? Was he whole? Could he serve? If not, he was left behind. The valley kept its own grim secrets, but those who passed were not celebrated with lullabies or soft cloth. They were taken in by the state. The agoge awaited, the brutal training system that molded boys into soldiers, into Spartans. At age 7, they were removed from their families and placed in groups called herds. They lived together in barracks, thin mats for beds, coarse cloaks for warmth, no shoes in any season. They were taught to endure. Pain was expected, hunger, routine, silence, a virtue. They were beaten not as punishment but as instruction. They learned to fight before they learned to write. They learned to steal, not because theft was right, but because it sharpened the mind. If they were caught, the crime was not the stealing, it was the being caught. Their voices were trained to be low, steady, no whining, no boasting, just control. A boy who cried too loudly would be mocked. A boy who showed fear might be struck, not cruelly, but coldly. Emotion was sanded down until only discipline remained. They played strange games, ones that ended in bruises and blood. They raced, wrestled, and sometimes fought with teeth, clenched and bare fists, drawing cheers from their peers and nods from their instructors. But they also watched. They observed the elders, the veterans, the way a man stood in a line, the way he held his spear without trembling. They learned to follow, yes, but also to calculate, to decide when to step forward. They slept side by side, boys of 10, 12, 14, learning to breathe in rhythm, to wake at the faintest noise. They whispered rarely, but when they did, it was in brief phrases, about tomorrow's drills, the ache in a limb, the shape of a cloud that reminded them of home. Home, a word they were taught to forget. By 15, the trials grew harder, days without food, nights alone in the hills, armed only with a knife, and the expectation that they would return stronger, sharper, more Spartan. Some did not return. Those who did not speak of what they'd seen. The state forged warriors, but it also erased softness, and yet, beneath the cloaks and grit, they were still children. They missed things they couldn't name. Warm bread, a mother's hands, the sound of laughter not followed by silence. But there was no room for nostalgia. Sparta had enemies, and in a land of stone and bronze, a boy's tears were not as valuable as his discipline, and so they endured and grew and vanished into history, not as individuals, but as a line, a shield, a wall that never broke. But before the formation, there was the boy, running across dust, trying not to cry, learning day by day to forget the sound of his own name. She is often remembered as a tragic queen, imprisoned and executed, her life tangled in betrayal and blood. But before the crowns, the trials, and the long years of isolation, Mary Stuart was a girl, a foreign child in a glittering court, her eyes wide beneath the velvet hoods of a very different world. She was born in 1542, in the chill of a Scottish winter. Her father, King James V, died just 6 days after her birth, and so she became queen, while still wrapped in swaddling cloth, too small to hold anything, let alone a scepter. A crown was placed above her crib, heavy with expectation. But Scotland was not safe. It was a land divided under threat from England and full of uncertain alliances. And so, at just 5 years old, Mary was sent away, across the grey churning sea, to the warmth and splendour of the French court. She arrived in the port of Roscoff, trembling from the salt air, her small hands clutching the fabric of her nursemaid's sleeve. The courtiers of France bowed, but also stared. A child queen, speaking Scots and Latin, surrounded by taller girls with brighter gowns and more fluent French. But she adapted. She always did. The court of King Henry II was one of pageantry. Balls, feasts, masks, intrigue whispered behind fans and folded letters. Mary watched, learned, and began to speak the language with a gentle accent. Her voice was soft but never unsure. She was educated alongside the king's children, including the shy, delicate Dauphin Francis, her betrothed. They were often seen walking together in the gardens, heads close, speaking in whispers. He was sickly. She was tall, graceful, strong, protective. Even then, she learned poetry, music, writing, falconry. She could quote Virgil by heart and still smile like a child when someone handed her a rose. She laughed easily, but behind her laugh was calculation. She understood that she was not just a girl, not even just a queen. She was a symbol, a pawn to some, a threat to others. The women of the French court adored her. Her hair was thick and reddish gold, her eyes deep and clear. They dressed her in silks, taught her the art of the curtsy, the placement of rings, the timing of compliments. But Mary held herself apart in quiet ways. She remembered Scotland, its mist, its cliffs, its simpler halls. Still, she flourished in France. She danced at masquerades with grace far beyond her years. She wrote verses and prayers in careful script, and when she turned 15, she married Francis in a ceremony of white and gold, surrounded by petals and incense and the careful clink of jeweled goblets. For a time, it seemed she had found her place, a queen of two nations, young, poised, beloved. But it was not to last. Francis, always fragile, grew ill. Within a year, he was dead, and Mary, just 16, was widowed, her future suddenly fractured. The court, once warm, cooled. Whispers returned. Her presence was less necessary, less convenient, and so she returned to Scotland to rule. But even in that moment, aboard the ship that carried her home through wind and spray, she remembered the girl she had been, draped in silk, running through the hallways of the Louvre, laughing with Francis in the orange groves, listening to music echo off vaulted ceilings. Those memories stayed with her, quiet, glinting like jewels at the bottom of a chest, long closed, not as sorrow, but as softness. Before he became the storm that swept across Asia, the founder of an empire so vast it bent the horizon, he was simply Temujin, a boy born on the cold Mongolian steppe, where the wind hummed like a bowstring and the grass whispered secrets that no city ever heard. He was born around 1162 near the Onon River. His people lived in felt-covered yurts, following their herds with the seasons, never staying long enough for stone to settle. Life was not still. It was ridden, chased, carried on the backs of horses and in the bellies of goats. And Temujin was born into this movement, into a world shaped by sky and silence. His father, Yesuke, was a tribal chief, respected, feared, and always alert. His mother, Huilun, had been taken from another clan and became a model of strength and endurance. Temujin was the second son, named for a Tatar warrior his father had just slain. His name carried blood and warning from the first breath. As a young child, Temujin learned the sounds of the wind, the pull of reins, the rhythm of hoofbeats. He was taught to ride before he could properly run. His legs were short, but his grip strong. He held onto the horse's mane and did not fall, even when others did. The elders nodded. The horses seemed to trust him. He learned to fire a bow while moving, his arms trembling at first, the arrows flying wild. But he watched the older boys, practiced with reeds, listened to the feel of the bowstring the moment before the release. He began to hit targets, small ones, then moving ones, then birds, startled mid-flight. But it was not just a life of skill and hunting. At the age of 9, his father took him on a journey to arrange a marriage. It was a common practice among Mongol tribes, alliances through future unions. Temujin was to be betrothed to Berthe, a girl of noble blood. They met shyly, spoke few words, but something passed between them, something calm, unspoken, a stillness amid the wind. But on the way home, everything changed. His father was poisoned by enemies, slowly, quietly. By the time they realized, it was too late. The boy returned to find himself not the son of a chief, but the son of a memory. Their family was abandoned by their own clan, their animals taken, their shelter pulled down. Temujin, not yet a man, was cast into the wilderness with his mother and siblings. Survival became his first kingdom. He hunted with snares, fished with bone hooks, scavenged roots and berries. His mother taught them how to boil bark, how to chew tough meat into something soft. They moved often, not out of choice, but necessity. Wolves followed them. So did hunger. Temujin changed. The boy who once watched birds now watched men. He learned to read betrayal, to mark who would stay and who would turn. He trusted little, spoke even less, and yet, even in exile, others followed him. Slowly at first, old allies, stragglers, those who remembered his father, those who saw in the boy a strange kind of gravity. He didn't lead with speeches, he led with certainty. He hunted without fear, fought without hesitation, shared what he had. He was captured once, taken by a rival tribe and locked in a wooden collar. It chafed his neck, limited his movement, but he endured, observed the guards, waited, and escaped. By the time he was a teenager, his name was beginning to return to the wind, not as a whisper of pity, but of potential. He married Björta, claimed back stolen lands, began to unite tribes long splintered by blood feuds. But beneath the title he would one day take, Genghis Khan, universal ruler, there was still the boy, the one who felt the cold of betrayal before the heat of command, the one who knew the ache of an empty stomach, the weight of watching a fire die too early in the night. And perhaps that's why he never ruled with comfort, because he remembered what it meant to be forgotten. She would one day lead armies, stand before kings, and burn beneath the eyes of men who feared what they could not control. But before she was a soldier, a saint or a heretic, Joan of Arc was simply a girl, a peasant child born into soil and silence, where the rhythms of life were marked by bells and the sound of rain on thatched roofs. She was born in Domremy, a small village in northeastern France, in the year 1412, during one of the darkest chapters of the 100 Years' War. Her parents were farmers, honest, devout and wary. The land was their measure of time, when to sow, when to reap, when to kneel and pray that the harvest would not fail. Joan was baptized in a cold stone church, her name whispered with hope. Her early days were not filled with prophecy or visions, but with chores. She fed chickens, swept ash from the hearth, hauled water from the well. Her hands grew rough early and her arms strong from labor, but she sang as she worked, hummed softly under her breath, and she listened. She listened to the sounds of war creeping through the countryside, of boots on roads, rumors spoken low at the table, the trembling hush that came when raiders passed nearby. England and Burgundy were at France's throat. Villages burned, men disappeared. And though Domremy was loyal to the French crown, loyalty did not stop fire. Still, Joan's childhood had light. She walked barefoot through fields of barley, felt the wind tugging at her sleeves. She watched the clouds and gave them names. She sat near streams with her brothers and traced her fingers through the cold water until they went numb. She helped her mother knead bread, the dough warm beneath her palms, and she prayed, not out of fear, but familiarity. Her village church was small, stone, and always just a little damp, but Joan returned to it daily, lighting candles with careful hands, kneeling for hours in silence. She spoke not just to God, but to saints, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. Whether they answered or not in those years, no one knew, but Joan believed they were listening. By age 12, her prayers grew longer, more focused. She began to hear things softly, faintly, not with her ears, but with something deeper, a stillness, a pull. She never told anyone at first. Instead, she worked, obeyed, smiled politely. But inside, something had awakened, a sense that her life was not meant to end in Domremy, that her hands, made strong by chores, were meant to carry more than buckets and baskets. Her neighbors thought her kind, quiet, unremarkable. But there was something in her eyes, a light not born from education or title, but conviction. Even then, when she stood in the pasture with her cloak flapping in the wind, she looked as if she were waiting for something, a signal, a calling. She said once, many years later, that she was only 13 when she first heard the voice. It came not as thunder, but as light, as calm, as certainty. From that moment on, she was no longer just Joan. She was becoming something else. But the girl who would lead soldiers through smoke and mud, who would ride with armor over a linen shift, who would face fire without flinching, still held inside her the barefoot child, the one who paused by the church each morning to press her hand against the cold stone wall, just to feel it, to remember where she came from, long before he wore the weight of modern Japan across his shoulders, before he opened his country to the world and watched the old ways slip into the past. Emperor Meiji was a quiet boy, not yet a symbol of progress or a name in textbooks, just a child tucked behind paper walls in a palace surrounded by still ponds and watchful eyes. He was born in 1852, in the closing days of the Tokugawa shogunate. His birth name was Mutsuhito. His mother was a concubine. His father, the Emperor Komei, was distant, cloaked in ritual, and removed from affection. In those days, the emperor did not rule. He performed. He sat behind screens and recited ancient poetry while the shoguns governed from afar. Mutsuhito was separated from his mother shortly after birth, a common practice in the imperial court. He would not be raised by her hands, nor cradled by her voice. Instead, nursemaids and tutors tended to him. They bathed him in silence, fed him in silence, taught him to bow, to kneel, to still his breath when passing an elder. The palace was quiet, always quiet. Lanterns flickered against painted walls. Footsteps were soft, measured. Even laughter was rare, gentle, polite, never loud. And so he grew up like a reed in still water, upright, bending gently to each breeze. He studied Chinese classics, memorized poems before he ever truly understood them. He wrote with a brush so fine his fingers ached. His days were shaped by ceremony, rice bowls positioned just so, mats aligned, the sound of a bell marking each transition, and outside the palace gates, the world was changing. Foreign ships had arrived, black and steaming, unlike anything the court had seen. Treaties were being signed, trade was being forced, the old world of Japan was trembling. But inside the walls, the boy remained still. He had never seen the sea, never touched a musket, never heard the languages of the foreigners who now landed in Yokohama, but his name was being spoken in back rooms and scroll-covered halls, whispers of succession, of change. When his father died, Mutsuhito was just 15. He ascended the throne, not fully knowing what that would mean. He took the name Meiji, enlightened rule, and with that name came a tide. He left behind the ancient ways of cloistered court life. He cut his hair, donned Western clothes, opened the nation to railroads, electricity, telegrams, but there was always a stillness in him, the trace of the boy who had once watched koi fish circle a garden pond, who had spoken rarely but listened always. Even as emperor, he wrote poetry, short verses, quiet thoughts. He spoke softly, chose his words with the same care he had been taught as a child, and though he modernized the nation, something in him always remained rooted in silence, in the hush of tatami mats, in the distant scent of incense rising between paper screens, in the memory of a boyhood not lost to tragedy, but to quiet, unseen, unspoken, unmoving. He would one day rule an empire that stretched across 3 continents. His name would be spoken in awe in the halls of Europe, in the sands of Arabia, along the sparkling shores of the Mediterranean. But before he was the magnificent, before the laws, the poetry, the conquests, he was simply Suleiman, a boy with a curious gaze and a quiet hunger to understand the world around him. He was born in 1494 in the city of Trabzon on the Black Sea coast. His father was Prince Selim, a fierce and ambitious man, and his mother was Hafsa Sultan, a woman of grace and formidable presence. The world into which Suleiman was born was not ordinary. It was gilded, structured, and watched carefully from behind velvet curtains. But even in a palace, a child still finds wonder. Suleiman's early days were marked by softness, the scent of cedar wood and citrus, the low rhythmic chants of prayers at dawn, the coolness of marble floors under bare feet. He was raised not to play idly, but to prepare. His crib was surrounded by scholars, guards, and echoes of power. By the time he was 6, he had begun his studies in earnest. Tutors taught him Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and later the intricacies of geometry, astronomy, and Islamic law. His handwriting was delicate, his mind sharper still. He memorized verses from the Quran with ease, but lingered over poetry, letting the language fall like music in his ears. He admired beauty, not just in decoration, but in logic, in the balance of a sentence, in the pattern of stars. He asked questions that startled his teachers, not because they were bold, but because they were precise, clear, thoughtful. He listened to stories of his ancestors, Osman, Mehmed the Conqueror, and wondered not only how they won, but why they fought. What did they leave behind? What did they take with them? At 10, he was sent to Manisa, a provincial city, to govern and learn the art of rule. It was tradition, a way to train princes not just with books, but with responsibility. There, away from the capital, he observed court life from the inside, heard petitions, watched how a wrong word could bend the mood of a room. He learned when to speak, and when silence held more weight. He walked among markets disguised, listening to the people, farmers, bakers, craftsmen. He wanted to hear their voices unfiltered, their worries, their laughter, their anger, and at night, in the hush of his chambers, he wrote poetry, always poetry. His verses were soft, often sad. They spoke of longing, of justice, of the passing of time. Not what one would expect from a prince trained to conquer. But Suleiman understood that empires rose not just on the blade of a sword, but on the breath of an idea. When his father became sultan, Suleiman was called to Istanbul. He was older now, more composed, more aware. He had seen the gears of governance, the burden of rule. He stepped into the Topkapi palace with reverence, but not hesitation. And when, in time, his father died, Suleiman became sultan. The boy who once sat in gardens studying calligraphy now commanded the might of the Ottoman Empire. He would go on to reform laws, expand borders, lead campaigns across seas and deserts. But even in battle, even surrounded by steel and cannon smoke, there were those who said they saw something unusual in him, a stillness, a listening, the kind of calm only found in someone who had once taken joy in the sound of a reed flute at dusk, or the quiet scratch of a pen across parchment, or the murmur of water moving through the marble fountains of childhood. She is remembered with a ruff at her throat, fire in her gaze, and an empire beneath her feet. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the monarch who defied expectation, ruled without husband or heir, and became the symbol of an age. But before the portraits, before the speeches and the pageantry, Elizabeth Tudor was simply a girl, alone in a tower, with too many thoughts and too few comforts. She was born in 1533, the daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a child born into brilliance and blood. For a moment she was celebrated, a princess, the long-awaited heir. But soon the tides shifted. Her mother was executed when Elizabeth was just 2.5 years old. Her status was stripped. She was declared illegitimate. And so, even as a child, she learned to stand carefully, to speak with precision, to smile without revealing too much. Her governesses taught her languages: Latin, French, Italian, Greek. Her mind caught fire early. She devoured books, asked questions, studied the histories of rulers, of their triumphs and their downfalls. But she also learned to read a room, to read a person. She watched how one phrase could shift a mood, how a glance could mean safety or danger. When she was a teenager, her sister Mary ascended the throne. Mary, who saw Elizabeth not just as a half-sibling, but as a Protestant rival. The court was tense, rumors swirled, plots real and imagined wrapped around Elizabeth like a cloak of thorns. Then came the summons. She was arrested, accused of conspiracy, treason. Heretics whispered her name. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same stone fortress where her mother had died. It was early spring, the sky grey, rain clinging to the stones. As she passed under the Traitor's Gate, she must have known this place did not forgive easily. She was 19. Her chamber was cold, damp, the windows small, the light slanting in like a hesitant visitor. The guards outside her door did not speak. The footsteps in the corridor made her sit upright at night. She could not trust anyone, not fully, not even the silence. And yet she did not break. She wrote, carefully. She chose each word like a piece on a chessboard. She prayed, not with show, but with sincerity. She folded her fear like linen and placed it neatly in a corner. When interrogated, she did not weep. She did not beg. She answered what she must, with clarity, with poise, but always with just enough space left between truth and accusation. She survived. She was released, not out of kindness, but calculation. And though she returned to house arrest and still lived in the shadow of the axe, something had shifted. Elizabeth knew now what it meant to be truly alone, to feel death close enough to name it, to be discarded by the court, the crown, the blood in her veins. And still she endured. In the garden of her confinement, she read Ovid and copied Latin by hand. She listened to birdsong and imagined, perhaps, the sound of applause. She rehearsed speeches in her mind, not for an audience, just for herself, to remember that her voice was still her own. When Mary died and Elizabeth became queen, she walked once again through those palace halls, but she had not forgotten the tower, the cold stone, the silence that tried to press her into despair. She wore her past like armor and ruled as one who knew that everything could be taken in a moment. But before she ruled, she waited, and in that waiting, a girl forged a queen, not in gold, but in grit, not in adoration, but in solitude. Before the battles, the maps, the emperorship, before Austerlitz, Waterloo, or exile on a lonely rock, Napoleon Bonaparte was a boy, a quiet, brooding child from a rocky island in the Mediterranean, where the wind spoke more often than people did, and ambition seemed as distant as the stars. He was born in 1769 in Ajaccio, Corsica, just months after the island was taken by France. His family was minor nobility, not wealthy, not powerful. Their home was modest, their table simple. They were Corsican, proud of it, but now forced to live under a new flag, under new rulers. His name was Napoleone di Buonaparte then. He grew up hearing stories of freedom, of Corsican resistance, of the land's fight to remain its own. These tales shaped him, gave him a fire even when his voice was still soft and his feet too small for boots. He was not a playful child, not really. He was intense, prone to silence, obsessed with books, especially the ones about war, strategy and Roman heroes. Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal. He memorized their campaigns, their choices, their mistakes. At age 9, he left Corsica to attend a military academy in mainland France. It was not a warm welcome. His accent marked him instantly. His clothes were too plain, his manners too rough. The French boys mocked him. He spoke their language awkwardly. He spoke back with facts, corrections, glares, sometimes with fists. He was lonely. He buried himself in study, mathematics, history, artillery. He walked the edges of the school grounds alone, thinking about formations, angles, patterns. He once wrote home saying he had no friends, only time and paper. But slowly, professors took notice. He was brilliant, unusual, disruptive in his confidence, but too sharp to ignore. He didn't just repeat answers, he questioned them. He wrote essays not just about battle, but about justice. He believed, even then, that the world was something to be rearranged, redrawn. When his father died, Napoleon was just 15. He stiffened, shouldered responsibility, wrote to his mother promising he would take care of everything. Even as a teenager, he imagined himself not as a boy, but a guardian, a leader, the head of the family. He was promoted quickly, given a commission, sent into the world as a junior officer, barely a man, already full of plans. But before the uniform, before the cannon smoke, there was the boy who stood on a Corsican hilltop, staring at the sea, hands behind his back, imagining what it would take to leave the island, to make the world remember his name. In the center of Beijing lies the Forbidden City, a walled palace of red and gold, vast and still, where echoes live longer than voices. And in the early 1900s, within that quiet labyrinth, a boy named Pui became emperor, crowned before he could read, feared before he could understand why. He was born in 1906, into the waning days of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial family of China. His world began not in freedom, but in ritual, layers of silk, slow-moving servants, the soft shuffling of slippers over marble floors. His cries were not met with lullabies, but with bowed heads and the hurried steps of attendants. trained never to speak unless spoken to. At age 2, he was lifted from his mother's arms, selected by the Empress Dowager Cixi herself to be the next ruler of China. They dressed him in yellow, the color of emperors. They placed a small crown on his head. They bowed to him. But Puyi didn't understand. He was a toddler, and when strangers pressed their foreheads to the ground in front of him, he wept. He would weep often, not from weakness, but from confusion, because the palace was not a home. It was a theater of silence and expectation. His every movement watched, his every gesture corrected. He was forbidden to run, forbidden to ask too many questions, forbidden in time from leaving. He had eunuchs instead of friends. He had concubines as nurses. He was surrounded by history, portraits of ancient rulers, scrolls of battles long past, rules written in gold ink on parchment he couldn't yet read. He was taught early how to sit, how to wave, how to hold a brush, but he was not taught why. His food was tasted before he ate. His lessons began at dawn. He was never alone, and yet often lonely. The city outside the palace was modernizing. Cars, telegraphs, suits and factories. But inside, time had stopped. He watched as servants lit lamps in rooms he would never use. He listened to the call of birds that flew over walls he would not be allowed to cross. He asked once, as a boy, if he could go outside. He was told, "You are the son of heaven. Heaven does not walk among commoners." And yet he wanted to. Not to escape, just to see. He tried to keep up with his lessons, history, calligraphy, Confucian classics, but his tutors were rigid, distant. They taught not with wonder, but with fear. One day, when he made a mistake, they beat him with a bamboo rod. The Son of Heaven cried. Later, he asked his servant why they had hurt him. The servant said, "Because they must teach you to be strong." He stared out the window for a long time after that, not angry, just quiet. When he was 6, the Qing dynasty was overthrown. The empire fell, but Puyi was allowed to stay in the Forbidden City, still dressed in yellow, still bowed to, still called Your Majesty, even as the world outside changed completely. No one explained, no one told him why he was no longer emperor in truth, only in name. He was a boy pretending to be a god, playing make-believe inside a palace that was becoming a museum. At night, he would lie in his vast bed, the canopy above him painted with dragons. He would pull the covers to his chin and try to remember what it was like to be held, to be a child, to laugh without permission. But the Forbidden City was not a place for children, only for shadows. And so the boy emperor drifted between dream and duty, half awake, half asleep, always watched, never free. And in the hush of those endless halls, you can still almost hear his footsteps, small, careful, echoing between thrones and ghosts. He would go on to conquer half the known world, from Macedonia to the Indus, riding through fire, sand and myth. But long before the battles, before the legends, before even the name, the Great, was whispered by poets and kings, Alexander was just a boy, with sun in his hair, a lion carved into his dreams, and questions no one could fully answer. He was born in 356 BCE, in Pella, the capital of Macedon. His father was Philip II, a warrior king, brutal and brilliant. His mother, Olympias, was fiercely proud, claiming descent from Achilles himself. From the very beginning, Alexander was raised to believe He was not merely royal, but exceptional. But even demigods must learn to walk. He grew up among noise and ritual, the clang of swords, the scent of oil and leather from the barracks. His father's generals whispered strategies over maps while he sat nearby, pretending not to listen. His mother lit incense at dawn and spoke of gods as if they were family. He was curious, fearless, not reckless, just endlessly sure that answers lay beyond whatever border he was told not to cross. He rode his first horse young. The beast was wild, snorting, stomping, refusing every rider. But Alexander watched its eyes, its posture. He realized it was afraid of its shadow. He turned it toward the sun, mounted it calmly, and galloped across the field before anyone could stop him. The horse's name was Bucephalus. They would ride together for years, across mountains and deserts. His tutor was Aristotle, not just a philosopher, but a craftsman of thought. From him, Alexander learned logic, medicine, ethics, but he also learned to ask, why does the world move the way it does? What makes a man noble? How far can ambition reach before it becomes destruction? Alexander's answers were not written, they were ridden. He watched his father build an empire of alliances and victories, but he also saw betrayal, wounds, the sharp cost of power. He saw his parents fight. He saw friends fall away. He saw what happened when greatness was demanded but never satisfied. And through it all, he dreamed, not of palaces, but of maps. At night, he would trace the stars with his finger through the open window, wondering what lay beyond the next ridge, the next river. He imagined cities buried in sand, kingdoms built on silver, languages that could reshape his name. He was 16 when he led troops for the first time. By 20, he was king. By 32, he was dead. But before it all, before the legacy, before the fear, before the crown, there was the boy who whispered questions into the wind, who held his breath at the sound of thunder, who stared too long into firelight, wondering what it would feel like to become a story. And perhaps even at the end, when the fever took him and he lay on cool stone beneath woven fans, surrounded by silence and shadows, and generals unsure what would come next, he might have remembered that boy, the one who turned the horse toward the sun and rode. Before the war rooms, before the speeches carved into the spine of history, before the bowler hat and the bulldog defiance, Winston Churchill was a quiet, awkward boy, more known for his stammer than for his stubbornness. A child not of trenches, but of long, echoing hallways and lonely letters home. He was born in 1874 at Blenheim Palace, a Baroque monument to his lineage, filled with gold-framed portraits and the kind of silence that made your footsteps seem too loud. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a politician, sharp-tongued, distracted, often absent. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American socialite, dazzling and distant. Winston was left, largely, in the care of nannies and tutors. He didn't mind being alone. Even as a boy, he preferred long walks to loud games. He spoke slowly, sometimes with difficulty. Other children teased him. His shoulders hunched a little more each year, as though bracing against the weight of always being misunderstood. At school, he struggled, not with ideas, but with obedience. He was clever but erratic. He forgot his homework, misplaced his books, stared out the window when he was meant to recite. His teachers called him stubborn, but really he was simply somewhere else. In his imagination, he read obsessively histories, battles, ancient Rome. He studied maps like others, studied faces. He copied out entire paragraphs from books just to feel the rhythm of the sentences under his pen. His letters home were filled with longing. He missed affection. He missed warmth. He missed being seen not as a disappointment, but as something whole. He wrote to his mother often. She rarely replied. He kept writing anyway. And slowly something inside him began to harden, not into coldness, but into a quiet resolve. If the world would not offer him gentleness, he would survive on grit. Later, he would attend military school. Later, he would travel, fight, write, speak, lead. But long before all that, there was the boy in the oversized coat, walking alone across a frost-covered field, whispering speeches under his breath, just to hear what courage might sound like. Before the manifestos, the ideology, and the pages that would ripple through centuries of revolution, Karl Marx was a quiet, serious boy growing up beside the Moselle River with more thoughts than friends, more notebooks than toys. He was born in 1818 in Trier, a sleepy town in what is now Western Germany. His father was a lawyer, well-read, liberal-minded, and deeply rational. His mother, warm but cautious, often reminded him to speak less, to avoid conflict, to not overthink so much. But Karl always thought. He was the third of 9 children, but he often seemed alone. While others played or squabbled, he would sit at the window and watch the street below, imagining lives he would never live, writing stories in his head before he could spell. Books were everywhere in the Marx household. Greek myths, Enlightenment essays, law texts. Karl read all of them, fast, hungrily. He asked questions constantly about fairness, about God, about why the world seemed so uneven. His parents smiled at first, then frowned, then simply nodded, unsure how to answer. At school, he was restless. He would drift between excellence and indifference. One day turning in a perfect essay, the next arguing with a teacher over a principle. Not because he wanted to be difficult, but because he wanted truth and couldn't bear to let contradictions slide. He made a few friends, mostly those who shared his appetite for debate. They would walk the streets of Trier in the early evening, their coats pulled tight against the wind, talking about philosophy as if it mattered more than food, which, to Karl, it often did. He fell in love with words. He wrote poetry, romantic, melancholic, full of yearning for something better, something vast. He showed them to a girl named Jenny. She smiled and didn't laugh. Years later, he would marry her, but at the time, he could barely look her in the eyes. His handwriting was small and intense. His room always a mess of ink-stained pages, half-read books, and the smell of candles burned down too far. He'd forget to eat, forget to sleep, but he never forgot a sentence he'd written. There was a quiet sadness to him, not dramatic, not obvious, just a sense that he saw the world's cracks earlier than most children did, and instead of looking away, he kept staring. By the time he was a teenager, his thoughts were no longer just observations. They were frameworks, patterns, early blueprints of a philosophy that had yet to find its name. He would go on to write in exile, to change how people talked about labor, power, and class. But long before the beards and the pamphlets, There was the boy in a drafty study, reading Plato by candlelight, pausing now and then to write a line of poetry that no one else would read, not for glory, just because he had to. Before the coils, the currents, and the crackling symphonies of electricity, Nikola Tesla was a boy who saw the world not for what it was, but for what it might become. A child with eyes too wide, dreams too strange, and thoughts too fast for even his tongue to keep up. He was born in 1856 in the village of Smiljan, in what is now Croatia. The nights there were quiet, and the stars bold, unhindered by gaslight or smoke. Nikola would stare at them for hours, not wishing or praying, but calculating, imagining what it might feel like to move among them, not just the stars themselves, but the spaces in between. His father was a priest. His mother, though uneducated formally, was an inventor in her own right, creating household tools, weaving intricate designs with clever fingers. Nikola loved her. He watched her hands more than her face. Her movements, precise and soft, were lessons. She told him that imagination was a kind of survival, that not all machines were made of metal. Even as a boy, he struggled to sleep. His mind refused to still. He claimed he could see flashes of light, images that floated behind his eyes, patterns, machines, places he had never been. Sometimes he would stand in a room, staring into space, and whisper a number or a phrase, as if chasing it through invisible fog. He could memorize entire books, recite passages backwards, solve equations others hadn't yet finished reading, but he was never boastful, just distant, like his mind was always slightly beyond the present. Other children called him odd. He didn't mind. He walked through forests alone, tracing geometric shapes in the dirt with a stick. He caught frogs not to harm them, but to study how they moved. He built little windmills out of sticks and leaves, and watched them spin until the sun went down. When he was 7, his older brother, brilliant, admired, died in a riding accident. The loss shattered the family. Nikola felt it in silence. He grew quieter, stranger. At night he dreamed of his brother's face, surrounded by sparks. He began talking to himself more, but what seemed like madness to some was simply overflow. His thoughts needed somewhere to go. He once became fascinated with water wheels. He studied how streams moved, how pressure built, how energy could be stored, transferred. He tried to build one in a trough behind a house using spoons and bits of rope. It didn't work, but he learned. He always learned. In school, he dazzled teachers, then exasperated them. He would solve a problem too quickly, then lose interest halfway through. He would invent things during lessons, sketch circuits in the margins of his Latin workbook. He spoke softly, walked lightly, always seemed half asleep, even when completely awake. He was afraid of pearls, repulsed by earrings, obsessed with the number 3. But beneath the quirks was a restless grace, a gentleness that carried through everything he did. He would go on to harness lightning, to duel with Edison, to dream up machines still beyond our reach. But long before the laboratories and lectures, there was a boy sitting by candlelight in a wooden house, spinning copper wire through his fingers, whispering to the future, not because he wanted glory, but because the visions would not let him rest. Before the flowers in her hair, before the paint-streaked canvases and self-portraits, that stared back at the world with unflinching grace. Frida Kahlo was a girl who watched more than she spoke, a child tucked into a blue house in Coyoacán, where the garden was louder than the guests, and colors said what words could not. She was born in 1907, though she would later claim 1910, the year of the Mexican Revolution, as her true beginning. From the start, her life was touched by contradiction. She was bold and delicate, joyful and aching, wild and still. Her father, Guillermo, was a photographer, quiet, precise, of German descent. He wore spectacles and kept his tools in perfect order. Frida would sit in his studio for hours, watching the light shift across faces, learning how expressions could be captured, how stories could live in silence. He called her his favorite. She returned the devotion with her whole heart. At 6, she fell ill with polio. The fever passed, but one leg was left thinner, weaker than the other. It gave her a limp. Children teased her, called her names, but Frida even then refused to shrink. She wore long skirts to hide the difference. She walked with a chin too high for pity, and she learned to carry pain as though it were part of her shadow. She spent long stretches alone, reading, drawing, listening to the wind in the cactus trees. The walls of her home, La Casa Azul, were a sanctuary of soundless strength. She explored every inch of its courtyard, tracing the cracks in the stone with her fingers, inventing stories for the ants, the birds, the falling petals. Her mother was practical, protective, religious. She ran the household like a ship, with Frida sometimes watching from the edge, sometimes helping, sometimes simply disappearing into a corner with a book and a quiet hum. Frida was sharp. She was curious. She asked the kind of questions that made adults pause. At school, she excelled, not just with facts, but with insight. She noticed things others missed, the sadness in a teacher's voice, the crookedness of a chalk line, the tension in a painting's brush stroke. She wanted to be a doctor, not because of ambition, but because she was fascinated by bodies, by how they broke, how they healed. She read about anatomy, sketched bones and muscles in her notebooks. She wasn't afraid of blood. She wasn't afraid of anything, not really. And then, at 18, a streetcar accident. Metal tore through her body, her spine, her leg, her pelvis. She should have died, but she didn't. She recovered, slowly, painfully, alone for months in a plaster corset, and during that time she began to paint. Propped up in bed, a mirror above her, brushes in hand, pain coiled in every breath, she began to turn her face into a canvas, not out of vanity, out of necessity, to understand what had happened, to survive. But before the accident, before the politics, the passion, the fame, there was the girl with one strong leg and one weak, wandering barefoot through her family garden, whispering poems to the leaves. The girl who already knew that silence was not empty, that it simply needed color. Long before the long novels, before the sprawling estates of Anna and Vronsky, before he put all of Russia onto paper with aching honesty, Leo Tolstoy was a boy staring out frostbitten windows, wondering how such a big world could feel so quiet. He was born in 1828 at the family estate of Yasnaya Polyana, bright glade, a quiet stretch of Russian countryside where birch trees stood like sentries and winter came with a hush that buried even sound. He was the fourth of 5 children, the son of nobility, but no stranger to loss. His mother died before he turned 2. His father died when he was 9. The great house, with its high ceilings and grand library, became a place of footsteps and faint echoes. The older siblings tried to smile, to keep things as they had been, but death leaves fingerprints on childhood. And Tolstoy noticed. He noticed everything. The way the frost clung to the window panes in lace-like patterns. The way the maids whispered behind hands when they thought he wasn't listening. The way his brothers would go suddenly quiet when they realized he had entered the room. He began writing before he knew why. He kept journals, scraps of notes tucked under books, observations about the dog's limp or the way the gardener coughed only when no one was watching. He wasn't trying to be profound. He was trying to remember, to pin life down before it slipped away again. He wasn't a prodigy. His tutors were often frustrated with him. His handwriting was messy, his attention wandered, and his mind tended to drift just before the answers. But he asked questions that weren't in the curriculum, about death, about goodness, about whether love changed when people left. He loved the woods. Yasnaya Polyana was surrounded by them, deep, soft forests, where the snow could muffle even your thoughts. He would wander off, mittens forgotten, boots clumsy, eyes full of something too big for language. He once said the forest made him feel small in the right way. At night he would lie in bed and listen to the crack of the firewood in the stove, the slow breathing of his brother in the next bed, the wind, always the wind. He dreamed of being a soldier, a monk, a farmer, a teacher. Sometimes, all at once, he didn't yet know what he would become. He only knew that stories mattered, that they could hold things other people let slip away. When he was a teenager, he tried university. It didn't last. He gambled. He drank. He ran from books and then ran back to them. But even when he lost his way, he kept writing. Always writing. He wrote of peasants and princes, of war and peace, of yearning, of boredom, of the 1,000 invisible threads that tie a soul to the earth. But before the pages stacked into volumes, before the world knew his name, there was a boy watching snow fall in a pine grove, listening to his own breath fog against glass, wondering why the world kept changing so quickly, and whether putting words on paper might somehow slow it down. Before the telescope, before the stars revealed their secrets, before his name became inseparable from motion, moons, and the weight of truth itself, Galileo Galilei was a boy who squinted at shadows and wondered why things fell. He was born in 1564 in Pisa, Italy, a city of leaning towers and echoing chapels, where bells rang early and the markets smelled of oil, herbs, and warm bread. His father, Vincenzo, was a musician and mathematician, a man who believed that nature had patterns and that those patterns could be measured. Galileo inherited more than just his father's name. He inherited his curiosity. He watched water ripple in fountains, dust spiral in beams of sunlight, and fruit drop from branches with a kind of slow, quiet reverence. He didn't know the formulas yet, but he already saw rhythm in the world, not in poetry, but in motion. As a child, he built things, pulleys, levers, crude clocks from wood and weight. Once he swung a lamp in the cathedral and timed its arc against his own heartbeat. over and over again. He didn't yet know he was measuring a law of physics. He just wanted to understand why it moved the way it did. He asked questions at the dinner table that made his mother sigh and his siblings laugh. Why doesn't the moon fall? Why can we hear thunder if sound travels slower than light? Why do wheels roll forward even when you push them sideways? He loved the sky even before he understood its math. He stared at it with the awe of a child and the focus of someone already trying to explain it. His early education was in a monastery. There, he was drawn to both prayer and pattern, scripture and symmetry. He studied Latin and theology, but his mind wandered. When he was supposed to copy religious texts, he sometimes filled the margins with geometric sketches or theories about falling objects. He was respectful, but never passive. Even as a teenager, he would respectfully disagree with teachers, offering alternative views, diagrams, and the kind of logic that made grown men stop mid-lecture and reconsider. When he enrolled at the University of Pisa, he was supposed to study medicine. That was the family plan. Respectable, secure, but it didn't hold him. He was more interested in numbers, pendulums, sound, the way things moved through space, even if no one had asked him to watch. He left medicine behind, quietly, determinedly. He began teaching math, designing experiments, dropping objects from towers, not to prove anyone wrong, but to let the facts speak in their own slow, steady language. And he never stopped looking up. He would go on to challenge centuries of belief, to build telescopes and peer into the shimmering dark, to see moons around Jupiter, rings around Saturn, spots on the sun, things others had never seen or had chosen not to see. But before that, long before Rome called him to account, before his name was etched into the bones of science, there was a boy sitting on a stone bench in the courtyard of a monastery, tilting his head at the sky, silently wondering why a bird's wings curved the way they did, and whether the stars followed a song only he could hear. And now, as the light of each story fades, and the quiet of night settles softly around you, we step away from emperors and poets, queens and questions. We let their childhoods rest, folded neatly like old letters placed back into drawers, their voices dimmed, their footsteps trailing off into the hush of dreams. It's strange, in a comforting way, to remember that all those names carved into history once belonged to children. That greatness, however loud it became, began quietly, with small fingers tracing the edges of stone, with questions asked not from podiums, but from garden benches and schoolroom windows. We've wandered through palaces and peasant homes, through snowy fields and sunlit courts, through places where fear lived under the floorboards, and others where laughter cracked like firewood, and all the while the world kept turning, unfolding, teaching. Each of them, before they were known, were unknown, carried by doubts, by hunger, by a feeling that maybe, just maybe, they were meant for something more, and perhaps not all of them were. Not in the way the world measures greatness, but in the stillness, in the watching, in the way they noticed things no one else bothered to see. There was already something magnificent. History often begins with a crown, a war, a book, a rebellion, but maybe it really begins with a whisper, with a quiet child watching snow fall against a window, with a barefoot girl in a garden mouthing poetry to herself, with a boy sketching stars he cannot yet name. So now we let them rest. We let the candle flicker lower. We let the fire become embers. We leave the marble halls behind, the dusty bookshelves, the cracked paint on the nursery walls of kings and queens, long buried, and we return to the quiet of our own rooms, our own soft pillows, our own warm breath in the dark. The stories will wait, they always do, but for now there is nothing to solve, nothing to conquer, nothing to remember, only the rhythm of your breath, the gentle weight of blankets, the slow drifting descent into the space behind your eyes. Let the stillness deepen. Let the thoughts grow distant. You are safe. You are still, and the world is gently asleep with you. Good night.